probably get going. Huh?
Yes.
Good afternoon. We're going to start our final panel now. My name is James Fader. I'm the pro bono chairman of the Environmental Law Society here at Florida Coastal. And our first speaker for the final panel will be Dr. Joseph Siry. A native of Miami Beach, Dr. Siry teaches environmental studies and in the history of science and technology to graduate and undergraduate students at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. He received his doctorate in environmental history from the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he studied with the late Garrett Hardin and Roderick Nash. His book on estuaries and the conservation of rivers and coast areas was published by Texas A&M University Press, entitled Marshes of the Ocean Shore. He was a volunteer technical advisor, member of the California Coastal Planning Process for Sonoma County, and a member of the Save San Francisco Bay, a citizen watchdog advocacy group. Upon coming to Florida to teach, he was keenly interested in preserving the coral reefs of the Key Largo area and became influenced by friends of the Everglades, Michael Chenoweth and Archie and Marjorie Carr, to actively engage the community in protecting biologically significant wildlife and fisheries. He helped two colleagues edit and produce Feeling the Heat as part of the Natural Resources Defensive Council 1999-2001 effort to have scientists analyze trends in the state to better educate policymakers about climate change due to global warming. An avid kayaker, hiker, snorkeling fan, and snow skier, Dr. Siry had advised over 25 masters, these including graduate work on endocrine disruption of wildlife, environmental literature, genetic engineering, quantum theory of God, among others. He teaches a class on Charles Darwin, reluctant revolutionary, and advocates for the teaching of evolution by means of natural selection in primary, secondary, and higher education. Very like his students, he is curious about the natural world, committed to protection of rivers, fisheries, and biological diversity. Because without the natural world, we have no accurate measure of human behavior, limitations, and responsibility. A founding member of the Association for Environmental Studies and Sciences, he writes and resides in Maitland, Florida. And here he is, Dr. Joseph Siry.
Thank you very much. I couldn't believe I did any of those things, but I appreciate your reminding me. And I wanted to thank Eric particularly and the group today. It seems to me, oh my gosh, in 1996 I first met Hal Wanless at a conference in Miami Beach where we were talking about the problems of climate change. So today I'm going to talk about the challenges of national security from climate change. Can you all read that? Should that be bigger? Can these get bigger? I'm a Mac person, but if you can read that, and can you see it back there? And okay, so I'll maybe stick with the pictures, but because I think you can read this for yourselves. But I think the premise is important, and probably more than any of the speakers today, except for some of the beginning speakers and some of the maps you just saw from the presentation on world hotspots. I'm going to ask you to think about matching your global imaginations today with this premise that the United States is indeed the world's perhaps largest empire, and we'll tell you more. Let's see if I can move. So I think you can read the premise, but you can just get an idea of the United States territories and military installations overseas. And I'm going to take a look at national and international security from the perspective of the fact that the United States Defense Department has over the last 8 years, and actually going back farther than that, since the Second Gulf War, has been concerned to the extent that the second quotation that you see here is from the national security implications about climate change. And AOSIS, for those of you who are not familiar, is the Association of Small Island States. to the recent COP21 meeting in Paris, their statement. You might compare the two. I have a short list of A, B, C, D, E things that you should take with you, but I think the premise is important, and that is if the United States maintains a global reach, which it does and has since at least Teddy Roosevelt sent the ships around the world, that we have to deal with global warming, I think, effectively by changing our imagination. First of all, I'll give you a couple of examples of that, but one of those examples is, you heard it this morning, it's accelerating. This is not a problem that is going to exist in your children's or grandchildren's generations. It exists now, and it is accelerating for several reasons. You'll hear from Eric more about ocean acidification, which again is accelerating and has a significant effect on sea life. But those are just some examples of what I mean by an expansive international imagination. If I click on this, by the way, this and the associated pages are available to students and those of you in the audience by just going to that URL on my website. But what do I mean by a global imagination? It's been 25 years, it's really been longer than that scientists have raised the alarm about climate change. Not just that, but there is, I think, a dangerous distraction in arguing about whether or not it's occurring, how fast it's occurring, and whether or not it's caused by human beings or not. I think it's a dangerous distraction, at least as far as the military is concerned. They decided to ignore it and start planning for serious problems. There is a window of opportunity. For those of you who like pictures, that window is closing, right? The reason that window is closing is because you've heard about the acceleration in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You heard earlier this morning Dr. Wanless tell you that it's been 23, or maybe it was Kevin who said 23 million years since we've seen this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the sea level was considerably lower now than it was then. So we have, for at least the foreseeable future, this is part of the global imagination, we have for the foreseeable future serious need to plan, not just for evacuating coastal communities, not just for trying to figure out how people will get to the Newport News Naval Base or how we will get to Mayport. Is it a naval base or is it an air station? Mayport. It's both. No, it's okay. How will people get there with rising sea levels? But more importantly, the military has taken it seriously and is beginning to think about ways to respond to global change, and that's what we'll talk about. So these several examples that are bulleted items, as well as defining mitigation. For those of you not quite sure what mitigation is using something to reduce the risks that's come from burning of fossil fuels. Adaptation is what you heard Dr. Wanless talk about earlier this morning, and others, or even the last two presentations. Adaptation is, well, what do you do when you don't have as much fresh water because of saltwater intrusion? Do you pump more water, fresh water, into the aquifer? Do you restore the Everglades so that it has enough water to be pumped out of the Biscayne aquifer and provide fresh drinking water for South Florida? And do you do that for the next 20 years, or do you do that for the next 40 years? Because we know, according to Wanless's argument this morning, that in 50 years, that area will most likely be brackish water, if not salt water. And that's not mentioning the saltwater intrusion that's already been occurring in South Florida and Southwest Florida because of rising sea levels. So that's called adaptation, all right? Finally, there's a widespread use of the fact that, and you've heard a lot of it today, and I wanted to remind you of this, that electricity should forevermore be wedded in your mind to water, and water should be wedded in your mind to electricity. For any of you who've lived through a hurricane in Florida, you know that you fill your bathtubs up because there's no water being pumped when the electricity isn't there. And if the electricity is being pumped by coal fire plants or natural gas plants, and the electricity wires are down because of the hurricane, you suddenly realize, oh, not only do you not have electricity, but I don't know, anybody been through a hurricane in Florida? Yeah, hands up, okay. What else can't you get? Electricity, gasoline. You can't get gasoline. So when you begin to think about, oh, okay, well, I'll just have a gasoline generator, all right, that will generate electricity for me or my hospital or my, worse yet, police station or prison. I mean, do prisons need energy during a hurricane? I don't know, but I would think so. The doors have to be locked, okay? But so I wanted you to at least think about the presentation that was a little earlier about not just solar, but wind and geothermal I'll talk about very quickly today, because the military is actually moving in that direction. But the reason I bring this up is that solar and wind, think about it, do they need water? Do they need consumptive use permits for water to generate electricity from solar or wind? But you never hear that in the discussion. So you need electricity to get water into your home, and in order to be able to generate electricity, you need consumptive use permits for water in order to be turned into steam to turn the generators, and that's usually done by natural gas, which you heard was 50% cleaner than coal. Coal in the state of Florida, as well as JEA. So that's kind of what I mean by an imagination to match our global reach. If you're not quite sure about the United States and where some of our bases are, this is some of the military installations, but on a map that was posted on a sort of underground site, this is where the United States bases are, also around the world. So as you can see, the military not only has a global reach, but it has a concern for how will it supply electricity, how will it supply water, how will it supply munitions and the like to these folks. The Defense Department, I'll let you read this, report concluded that they are already observing impacts of climate change. This is this section right under the map. And their global reach includes the opening of the Arctic as a challenge to the Navy. I think the first cruise ship will take place this summer, supposedly, through the Northwest Passage in the Arctic, which is now less encumbered by ice than it used to be. But the Department of Defense gave a report in 2015, in July, last summer, to Congress. And among the things they mentioned, and this is a map of the floods in 2000, I believe, 10, in Pakistan, they mentioned two things that the United States Department of Defense had to respond to, and is part of what they're planning for in the future. And that is, they sent humanitarian aid. As you can see, 18 million people were disaffected by the floods in Pakistan, and United States was responsible for delivering with other countries humanitarian aid to the Indus River along the Punjab and in Pakistan. I love the map that you saw earlier that the University of Florida professor showed you about water stress areas, because we'll come back to that when we take a look at some of the hot spots. But if we take a look at national security threats, and most of this is quoting Defense Department studies themselves. This presentation is based largely on what does the military think it needs to be doing. Chuck Hagel, even a year before this report was made, as you can see here a little farther down, argued that this is a threat multiplier. There has a statement in the year later, 2015 summer report, that to a large extent the Syrian civil war can be understood, as well as some arguments made for the Arab Spring, as good examples of climate change not being connected in the media and not being connected in our imaginations to areas of perennial disruption and perennial food shortage, and more importantly, perennial water shortages. The argument is a difficult one, but not that difficult to explain to your neighbors, and that is, as Syria began to dry out, people began to move out of rural areas in Syria into cities. It overloaded the infrastructure of cities. There was insufficient water for people and an inability of civil authorities to meet people's needs. This is what the DoD is concerned about. It's a short 20-page report that I suggest you could take a look at. The Hill reported it. So this link will take you to the, and this is a year before the report to Congress. Oops. Do I have to? Yeah. They always want me to sign up for this one. But anyhow, you can get a report as far as the DoD Adaptation Roadmap. Now, very quickly, you might say, well, so what are we doing in order to think about this? Addressing climate change is urgent, according to foreign allied sources, as well as that it being Great Britain. But the Stockholm Environmental Institute, I think you should compare their arguments with what you're going to see as we move through what the military perceives as a serious problem. We know that the rates are increasing over time. If you want to see the monthly average, you can see by day by going to the NOAA website. We'll come back, if I can, to another NOAA website for this area as far as sea level rise is concerned. But this is the current readings for the amount of unprecedented levels of carbon dioxide equivalent in the atmosphere as measured in Hawaii. Time is at a premium. If you didn't take that away from today's presentations, think again about it. Time is at a premium. I look around the room and many of the young people here will be hearing this over and over again, but it is ironic that about 20 years ago we were told that the window was closing and time is at a premium and we better start acting. We have since seen Arctic thawing, and you can see the 5 consequences that come under what does Arctic thawing mean, and Dr. Wanless went over some of that. More importantly, over a third of the world's population relies on water that comes out of the Himalayas, and we want to connect this now in your imaginations to, so what happens when a good many people in Asia do not have sufficient water, or they don't have the traditional amount of water that they needed to meet their needs? Well, some experts have argued that certainly one of the earliest examples of climate change's impacts without actually attributing it to climate change was in the Sahel region south of the Sahara Desert, and that is a slow drying out of those areas between Eritrea, Ethiopia, Niger, Nigeria, and Mauritania. And of course, Darfur and the refugees in Darfur are one great example of an important change that occurred because of changes in weather patterns. But more importantly, there has been a call, especially by this author here, Jean Genzel, that we need to change the definition of refugees. There are no definitions for climate refugees. There is under the United Nations, you can be a refugee from terrorism. You can be a refugee from a government that's trying to put you in jail, I guess if you're a Muslim Brotherhood member in Egypt. But more importantly, you cannot just tell people that you're trying to get to Greece or France or Germany or England today out of Syria because you're a climate refugee. You have to tell them that you are basically a victim of terrorism or civil war. The civil wars, as you can see, in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and the like, according to the Defense Department, increase the risk of instability and conflict overseas, to which the United States is going to either be encouraged to respond to in a humanitarian way, or more importantly, as you know, politically, many people, including John McCain, have called for United States intervention in Syria, as if something we could do to solve the problem that I believe is complicated by climate change. Then there's finally, according to the Department of Defense, failed states. The Maldives, Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan. And what are these failed states? We should probably put Afghanistan on there. But they're failed states because they are breeding grounds for groups like in Nigeria, the Boko Haram. Did I get that right? Boko Haram? I'm from the generation that remembers Boko Haram, so just kidding. So you might say, what do all these areas have in common? Well, as you can see, the developed world at night generates a good deal of electricity. If you keep electricity and water in mind, you'll understand my concern today that we start thinking about wind and solar power alternatives in terms of in terms of what's available. And that is, this is a map of the world that shows us the availability of solar energy and some of the areas that are most affected by unstable civil disturbances wouldn't be solved, of course, by solar energy. But then again, it's only exacerbated by those places that need to rely on coal or oil or natural gas for their electricity needs. So let me just, you may have seen this, you may not have seen this, but there are ways for us not to be able to continue business as usual. Business as usual will cause the Earth's temperature on average to rise by 4 degrees Celsius. The arguments in Paris had to do with bringing this down to below 2 degrees Celsius. As you can see, this brings us into this a group of ways that we might begin to think about stabilizing our increases in temperature. And to cut to the chase, I think nothing speaks louder than those trucks sitting under solar panels. This is in the United States, but certainly it's been used in rural parts of Afghanistan. Upwards of 30% of our casualties in Afghanistan, it has been estimated, were casualties of those troops guarding the supply lines in Afghanistan that brought oil and gasoline and water to the United States forces in Afghanistan. So it may seem ridiculous to have electric vehicles, but the Defense Department is seriously considering it. What will climate change bring? Refugees. But what can the Defense Department do? And you might say, why the Defense Department? Well, the United States military is the largest purchaser of energy in the world. Right. It is also the largest consumer of oil and gas, as you can imagine. This is a naval base in the United States. On this webpage, you can actually hear that since 2008, especially NATO and the British have been concerned about climate change and instability around the world. This is a Air Force base in the Mojave Desert in the West that the Department of Defense is moving to using a lot more renewable energy. And the interesting thing about the renewable energy being used by the Defense Department is they've decided that they would go, as I don't know if you can read this because it's so small, mostly geothermal. Geothermal does use water, but geothermal energy is abundant in the western states at depth. And there is another way of thinking about geothermal that we might just discuss in the Q&A period. The military is slowly cutting its fossil fuel reliance. It hasn't met its 5% goal, but as you can see, the interesting thing is these are global warming tipping points around the world. It's a small map, but you can also compare it to where should geothermal areas for development be situated. And the larger the circle in this map that I'm pointing to, the larger the circle, the more geothermal energy that's being converted into electricity in these areas. When you begin to think about it, for those of you who followed the Japanese disaster at the Fukushima nuclear plant, anybody know what is ironic about Japan's thinking that it can solve its energy problems with nuclear energy? Where does Japan sit? Where 3 faults come together, it's a lot of volcanic activity. One could even argue that many island areas are available, have geothermal available. I want to leave you with this map since you heard a really interesting argument from the previous discussion, and that is why is the DoD thinking about using solar and wind and renewable energy sources? As you can see, the areas in this map where water supplies are most vulnerable to population increases are also where water supplies are not that available. Armies may run on gasoline, as the Germans realized in 1944 and 1945, but armies also run on water. And for every gallon of gasoline, it takes about 10 to 100 gallons of water just to purify the oil into gasoline. So I hope you'll leave today realizing that if you, the takeaway is that if we do not begin to think about climate change as a strategic issue, and there are some downsides to that, the military will. And if we do not face climate change as a serious threat to the United States and world stability, the military will. And the question is, would we rather have civilian change come to play in our future, or will we rely on the military to respond to climate change the way it had to send 16,000, I think, personnel to Superstorm Sandy. And there's some maps on here if you want to see Sandy, but I know you're going to talk about ocean acidification. But the DOD sent 16,000 personnel during the Sandy disaster, and as you well know, that was just a small tropical storm as opposed to the needs that the DOD might find if it had to respond to storms in Texas or Florida. So, with that in mind, the takeaway is if you don't do something about climate change, the military will do it for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Siry. Lastly, and certainly not least, is Professor Eric V. Hall. He is an associate professor of law here at Florida Coastal, where he teaches courses in administrative law, environmental law, ocean and coastal law, property, toxic torts, zoning, and land use law. He coordinates the environmental curriculum and environmental externship program, and he serves as the faculty advisor to the Environmental Law Society. Professor Hall has published a wide range of environmental law topics with emphasis on impact of pollution on marine systems, human life, and the environment. His articles have appeared in leading law journals and in texts covering international ocean governance, the impacts of climate change on the ocean and coastal systems, and environmental and animal law. His articles on ocean acidification was nominated as one of the top environmental and land use law articles of 2014. He served as a litigation associate at Schwartz Campbell LLC and as a judicial law clerk for the Honorable Earl W. Patterson Jr. and for Honorable C. Allen Lawson at Florida's 5th District Court of Appeals. Prior to entering the legal field, Professor Hall served as a fisheries volunteer in the United States Peace Corps and as a chemist responsible for treating hazardous wastes and collecting them from surplus sites, and completed his undergraduate degree in biology and graduate degrees in marine biology and coastal zone management. He is admitted to the practice of law in the state of Florida as well as before the U.S. Supreme Court. And here he is, Professor Eric Hall.
So if memory serves me correct, if you're the last kid on the playground that's invited to play, you still get to play. So I'm here to play with something that is very, very significant. And I think it's particularly interesting that really until Joseph mentioned the topic of my presentation today, we really didn't hear anything about ocean acidification, right? The focus is on the planet warming and sea level rise and responses to those changes. But when you look at our planet and being 70% water, what's happening in the ocean really does matter, and we need to be paying attention to it. And what is happening is actually quite scary. I'm opening with this quote because it's very interesting to me. It used to be the canary in the coal mine. Now it's the oyster in the half shell. And that was a comment made by Governor Jay Inslee of Washington following a massive die-off of oysters off the coast of Washington that resulted from upwelled, very acidic, corrosive water. All of the oyster larvae and many of the beds died. And that prompted Washington to take very significant action. I was out at a conference a couple of months ago and learning a lot about what they're doing. And they're very proactive. They are leading the charge on ocean acidification because of what actually happened to the oysters in the in the community. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But I want to just very briefly talk about the chemistry of ocean acidification, just for anybody who maybe is not interested or not versed in how this actually works. So in simplest form, you have gases exchanging at the air-sea interface, right? It's a very dynamic system, and gases move in and out of the system. And in a normal system, you have carbon dioxide mixing with the water, forming carbonic acid. It turns into a bicarbonate. And in a normal system, that then breaks down in a reversible reaction to carbonate ions. And that carbonate ion, along with very similar ions, are used by shell-building organisms and calcifying organisms, reef systems, etc. In a high carbon dioxide environment, this reversible reaction tends to favor the formation of bicarbonate, taking those carbonate ions away. And as a result of that, what you have is you have more hydrogen ions in the water that are released. And if you look at if you remember probably from 8th grade science class, the pH scale goes from 0 to 14 and neutral being 7. And it's largely a factor of the amount of pH, of hydrogen ions in the water body. So as you increase the amount of hydrogen ions in the water body, the water moves to be more acidic. Now, it's a little bit of a misnomer, because the water is not acidic at this point. It is still basic. The pH of ocean water is roughly around 8.1 or a little bit below that right now, but it is tending toward that acidic side. And as we continue to move closer and closer to the 7s and further down, there are a number of consequences associated with that. And so this bottom reaction, what you see there is that even where you have calcium carbonate that's already been formed in shelled organisms and in coral systems, etc., in a high acid environment, that starts to dissolve. And when you look at the reports of this, it's interesting, because you might think that, well, this is something that is occurring or may occur in the distant future, but that is anything but true. And I'll show you what I mean by that. All right, so as we heard all day, the primary cause of climate change that has been recognized is the increasing atmospheric emissions of carbon dioxide into the air. And if you saw some of these early charts, the early what's called the Keeling curve, where we're looking at the increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide, the emphasis since the early 1950s has really been on the input of those gases into the atmosphere, with understanding that some of those gases are sequestered in land masses, and some of it is going into the ocean. Well, until relatively recently, the focus had been on atmospheric compositions of carbon dioxide. And it's only really been in the last 20 years where we've started to focus on what is happening in the ocean environment. And so if you follow this, the increase in carbon dioxide, we've seen this before. And I want to point something out to you. I finished this a while back, and I haven't updated it. If you looked at Joseph's slide, for the parts per million of carbon dioxide, he actually had a different number. He had 404. And what I want to draw your attention to is look at when I updated this, February 5th, 2016, and just in a couple of weeks, we've moved from 402.52 up to 404 roughly. So this is changing quickly, just in a span of a few moments. And you probably have heard this concept and the 350.org where the United Nations has recognized that that's probably the safe limit, and we start going beyond that, we'll have problems. Well, we've far surpassed that. And there's an interesting phenomenon that occurs with this. As the carbon dioxide goes up into the atmosphere and the parcel pressure of carbon dioxide increases, what you see is a decrease in the pH of the ocean water. And now, as you extrapolate out, you can see that it will continue to go down. An associated component of that is with the decreasing pH, you also have decreases in some of the ions that are utilized by reef-building organisms, shelled organisms, to make their calcium carbonate shell or their structure. And you see a clear decline in both of these, aragonite and calcite, with increasing pH or decreasing pH in the water. And so pre-industrial era pH was about 8.2. Right now, it is roughly between 8.1 and 8.07. It's projected to decline by the turn of the century to around 7.8 to 7.7, somewhere around that area, and deeper or higher in the deep ocean because colder waters are able to hold on to the carbon dioxide a little bit more. So this is a troubling phenomenon that is occurring now as we speak. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, Washington State dealt with this head on, and it's tied to the decreasing pH of the ocean body and the inability of organisms effectively to make the shells that they are required to survive. But that's only part of the story. There are other contributing causes to ocean acidification, which include land-based runoff of inputs that can lead to additional carbon in the environment, nutrient runoffs that we still haven't been able to manage that can lead to algal blooms. And the algal blooms, blossom and then they die, and the decomposition releases more of that carbon dioxide into the water. All of that contributes to the acidification of the water. We have secondary gases that generally don't get talked about with ocean acidification, but they are problematic. These sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides that we looked at to control because of acid rain. If you remember back then, when I was a kid when we were talking about acid rain, those gases are still being emitted, and they do have effects on the environment. So they're contributing causes to ocean acidification. Any type of decomposition or respiration, and any type of coastal development. Wow, that was fast. And so if you look at what has happened in some of these areas with this runoff, you have areas like the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. This year was 6,400 square miles. That's about the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island together. And it's larger than it was last year. And part of it is because of the Mississippi Delta and the runoff causing these anoxic zones. All of that is a really clear example of what can happen. But these types of runoff from non-point source pollutions, et cetera, they exist along coastal zones throughout the country. And so this natural and anthropogenic contributions of CO2, they add together, and it's important to understand that we already deal with, the marine environment already stressed by other co-occurring environmental stressors like increasing temperature and habitat loss and invasive species. So all of this is happening together to work synergistically to augment the impacts of this. So I want to talk briefly about some of the issues that are going on that are really problematic. Marine bacteria make up a large percentage of the biomass in the ocean, and they're important because through processes of nitrification and ammonia oxidation, they address primary production. With low pH, what has happened is the nitrification and ammonia oxidation processes have slowed. And there's been a number of reports that have come out to say that could be a limiting factor with regard to ocean primary production. Marine pteropods they're a part of the base of the food chain. Live marine pteropods were taken out of the Southern Ocean, and they showed visible signs of deterioration tied to exposure to acidic water. Scientists took these into the laboratory and mimicked conditions of the ocean that are expected to occur under business as usual scenarios, and within 45 days the shells completely dissolved. Oyster larvae, the reason why the oyster larvae up in Washington died is because the absence of the ions that they needed to build their shells required them to spend an extra amount of energy trying to find the limited amount of ions. And what that did is it left them vulnerable. It took their energy sources and left them vulnerable for other stressors. And essentially what the researchers found is that they just didn't have the energy left to build or to develop to the next stage. And so the whole areas of within Washington just collapsed. We're seeing this in Jacksonville and throughout the country where low pH waters are causing or can contribute to the increased growth and toxicity of some of the types of like this Alexandrium. So these are the types of organisms that get accumulated in shellfish and can contribute to paralytic shellfish poisoning. That toxicity has increased and the growth rate has increased. They moved pink salmon into more acidic water, and what they found was a whole host of impacts, developmental impacts, behavioral impacts, changes in predator-prey reactions, a whole host of things that are tied to pH. And this should not be surprising that that organisms like this would respond to this. If you look at the human body, our pH is between 7.34, 7.45, somewhere around this. It's a very small range. But if you change that very slightly, where it's known that you can have arrhythmias, you can have major physiological response to that. So we should expect that organisms that are experiencing changes in pH would also have similar physiological responses. And an emerging number of evidence shows that that is in fact true. We see this throughout the country, but we also see it here in Florida. You can see that the calcification rate has continued to go down. If you look at two areas in the Caribbean and you look at the productivity and the biomass and the types of corals there, it's changing. So if you're looking at this, you can see it very clearly. In Florida, we've had reefs in decline for both temperature and other stressors since the 1970s, and that's continuing to go on. The expectation from scientific studies that are out there now is that this is going to continue, that calcification is going to decrease and carbonate dissolution, so their shells or the superstructure of the corals are expected to increase. And that is in addition to one of the key stresses for corals, which is increasing water temperature. Keep in mind that as we're dealing with this, and as we talked about, Hal talked about earlier about what's going to happen to the coastal areas, we keep moving to the coast. And in the process of moving to the coast, this may be a little bit hard to see, when you get to these coastal watershed counties, the number of individuals per unit area increases dramatically. So if you're in a coastal shoreline county or a coastal watershed, the number of people per square hectare continues to increase, which has a whole host of implications as we not only deal with sea level rise, but also deal with the inputs from human activity into the coastal zone that contribute to what we're seeing with ocean acidification. Just recently, 2015 study in the Journal of Nature and Climate Change showed that Florida is one of 15 states that is at significant risk of economic harm as a result of our ties to oysters and our economic connection with activities that exist along the coastline. The Florida Panhandle ranked 11th out of all the states, and ranked 11th with regard to danger and the connection between the activities there and the economic hardship that could result if under business as usual scenarios. So what does this do? Well, it leads to, if we tie it into the whole discussions today, these physiological responses that we're seeing in marine life can lead to reductions in those marine life. So it can lead to reduced commercial fisheries. It can certainly lead to reduced recreational fisheries, reduced ecosystem services, which is what Christine was talking about, tourism and recreation impacts, and a whole host of other harms. So I'm going to, just for purposes of time, I'm going to run through this next couple of slides quickly so I can get to some of the responses that we can possibly engage in. If you look at the international response and you look at our domestic response to ocean acidification, it can be summed up in one word: research. That's what it is. It's tied to research. On the federal level, on the international level, it's really tied to activities that provide the research, that provides the science to support the policies. And as that is going on, as we continue to develop the science to support the policies that are in place, all of these impacts are occurring. And so if you look at international response, even with the Paris Council of the Party, they talked about it but didn't require any kind of meaningful action. Scientists, some of the key scientists, marine scientists throughout the world got together and talked about the impact of ocean acidification and the reality that we're dealing with, and the voice has largely been unheard. In the United States, we have our ocean stewardship policy, which recognizes that ocean acidification is significant and something that we need to concern ourselves with, but is largely, it largely dictates the development of research and evidence to support policy. Same thing with the strategic plan. The Clean Power Plan, this has been mentioned many times. When we talk about climate change, when we talk about changes tied to that sea level rise, it's about the emission. Primarily, it's about the emission of carbon dioxide into the air. Clean Power Plan was part of a response to essentially what was going on in Paris. It's essentially the plan from the Obama administration through the EPA to limit the emissions. And as Patrick mentioned and somebody else mentioned, recently the U.S. Supreme Court stayed implementation of that as that works through the court. So we're sort of left in limbo with regard to how that's going to come into play. The recent legislative action, each one of these is actually tied to including research or providing incentives to get to research or providing incentives to assess the vulnerabilities of community. But what is so important about all of these is none of them require direct action. They don't require direct action. And the reason why that's important is because when you look at the marine environment, most of the activity, or a good portion of the activity, is along the coast. If you look along the coastlines, the shallow water basin areas, they support up to about 30%, 10 to 30%, you see the different statistics, of primary production, in part because of upwelling and nutrient inputs and from land to sea, etc. But there are also areas in those shallow areas of significant carbon sequestration. So we sequester a lot of carbon there, and we also have a lot of land-to-sea inputs in that zone. And so because of that, and because of the sort of reluctance to create enforceable policies that mandate specific actions, states are starting to respond. And Washington is a really good example of how you can respond to this and still make some changes. Okay? So one of the changes that is underway, Washington was sued by the Center for Biological Diversity a while back because they refused to list marine waters as impaired water under the Clean Water Act. And the suit ultimately was settled out of court. But what it led to is a recognition that the water quality criteria for marine waters is out of date. It was created in 1976. It has a very large span, and it goes essentially from 8.5 to 6.5 with no greater change than a 0.2 difference in the naturally occurring pH of the water body. The problem with that is that we don't really know in many cases what the naturally occurring pH is of the water body. And the states, those water quality standards go from the shoreline all the way out to the extent of state jurisdiction. So you have lots of different depths, and so to get an accurate measure of pH in that off coastal waters has proven very difficult. And so the end result of that is that in many cases pH can decline in those coastal environments below that or to levels that harm marine species and yet still not violate marine water quality criteria. So there's something wrong there, and Washington has responded, and I think many states are going to start to do the same thing. And so what can we do? Well, we can look at the inputs along the, as sort of a stopgap. This is not the primary solution. We need to have reductions in carbon dioxide. But what do you do while you're waiting for that? Well, there's a couple of things I just want to touch on very briefly because of time. One is, let's look at the inputs to the ocean environment along the coastline. Let's look at the parts that are regulated and see if we can change the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permits and water quality standards to more accurately reflect what is going on in the coastal zone. And that's what's going on in Puget Sound in Washington. They are looking at the water quality, they're assessing their water quality standards and sort of reassessing as sort of a stopgap as you wait for effective policy. So we can do that there. We can look at where the inputs are and any factors that could possibly contribute to decreasing ocean pH, and we can work on that. We can create water body specific acidification limits. You can create under the Clean Water Act, and this is probably the one that is going to gain the most traction in the short term. If you have water quality standards and they cannot be met based on the available technology, what ends up happening is the state has to list them under Section 303 as impaired waters. And then they have to create a TMDL, which is a total maximum daily load. When you create a total maximum daily load, that accounts for all inputs, both direct point sources that are regulated under the Clean Water Act, non-point sources, any type of atmospheric deposition that may occur. So the EPA, in settling that suit with the Center for Biological Diversity, said, we're not going to change the water criteria, but we suggest that you start using TMDLs in those coastal waters to address these issues. So using TMDLs and modifying them to recognize where you have coastal waters that may actually be harmful to marine life, but yet not violate the existing marine water quality standards, it's counterintuitive. So we have to change the water quality criteria, and to the extent that we still have impaired waters, we have to change the TMDLs. And interestingly enough, there was a TMDL meeting here today, and it'd be interesting to see how states respond to addressing coastal waters where there's no other regulation. So very quickly, I just want to mention this, and then I will close. We have nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides. Those can be indirectly covered through a TMDL. There are TMDLs in New England. There's one that has a regional TMDL that addresses atmospheric deposition into water bodies. There's one in the Chesapeake Bay. So there are regional TMDLs that can be used indirectly to address atmospheric deposition of materials. So in New England, they have one for mercury, right? Mercury emitted from coal fire plants gets into the air and gets deposited in the water. So how do you get mercury out of the water? You know, Patrick talked about methylmercury and how it works its way up the system. Well, one of the ways you do that, if you can't control the mercury yourself, is to, through a TMDL, is to actually set a maximum amount of all pollutants into a water body, including those from an atmospheric source. You could do it directly under the Clean Air Act, but because of trading schemes, it's a little bit more difficult that way. But one thing I would like to just emphasize is this, and we've seen it today and there were a number of really great questions about the coastal zone. What do we do with development along the coastal zone? Okay, 1 hectare of an intact coastal system sequesters more carbon, right, or five times more carbon than a tropical forest. And we don't hear that. We continue to build along the coastal zone, and we continue to release that carbon from the coastal zone. And not only do we release it from the coastal zone, but then we take away all those extremely valuable ecosystem services. So we need to look at this blue carbon in a different way. And as Christine mentioned, we need to take a more honest assessment of ecosystem services and develop programs that encourage or provide market-based incentives to preserve where recognized. And the last point I would just make is that we need to increase the number of marine protected areas because there are additional criteria or protective criteria there. And I'll close with this because I think it's a very poignant statement. Cannot condemn our children and the children to the future that is beyond their capacity to repair, not when we have the means, the technological innovation and the scientific imagination to begin the work of repairing it now. That's what Washington is doing. They are very active and they're leading the world. The rest of us have to catch up. Thank you.
Questions or? No, I have.
We need to pay more attention to that.
I don't know if I missed it, but is directly to the rising temperatures of the ocean?
Well, it's interesting because the acidification is based on chemistry, the chemistry of the carbonate chemistry. But changes in ocean temperature do influence how that chemistry actually works. And so what you see in the literature, scientific literature, is you see differential responses of pH based on temperature, and you also see species-specific responses to pH. So I mentioned corals. Florida corals have been in decline. University of Miami researchers that have been looking at it have been focused on temperature. And one of the things that they've noticed is temperature with reduced pH. They're seeing with hard corals actual dissolution exceeding growth in parts of the northern Caribbean, right, for hard corals. But then another story showed that soft corals, Florida gorgonians, actually thrive in that environment. So there are species-specific responses. Seagrasses and other organisms that need certain chemicals can thrive, and others actually are impacted. So there's a lot to learn about this for sure, and that's probably why so much of the activity is based on research. But there's also a lot that we know right now. With Washington, for example, losing a good portion of its oyster industry to lower pH. So it's a combination of multiple factors. I think the most immediate impact you're going to see is animals spending, or marine organisms spending more of their energy budget to find those limited ions that they need to build their shells. And when it's like anything else. If you just look at the organism flail, you have an energy budget, and when you use an extensive amount of it in your lift, you become more vulnerable to other stresses. And so in a lot of the studies, what they're finding is that the undersaturation of the ocean with regard to these shell, these ions used to build, is actually creating energy budget issues with the organisms. And because they have limited energy, they either have developmental problems or they become more and more vulnerable to stress. And so add that to the existing stressors, right? You have you are adding something that increases the vulnerability of those species to the existing stresses. So it's
Thanks a lot, Eric. It turns out that I actually filed an amicus brief in that CDM case. Yeah, I filed it on behalf of Ken Caldera and who's the former NOAA administrator? Oh well, bad brains. She's a very well-known marine scientist. Here's the point. We argued that EPA's water quality criteria for marine waters is pH, and it's too crude a method. I mean, the pH range in the ocean masks what's happening with CO2 deposition. So the scientists the information we presented to the court didn't work, but the information we presented suggested you need to be measuring the ion you're talking about, which is aragonite, and you need to measure the dissolved aragonite in your coastal waters to really find out what's going on with the deposition. That's what's creating the corrosivity in the water. That's literally, and you can see it, dissolving the shells of oysters. You can actually see it real time. So that's a suggestion.
Absolutely.
So I think shell fishermen are going to see it first. The yield that you're going to see, and will we pay more for clams, and will we pay more for oysters, and do we pay more for shellfish? I think we do, but you'll see that probably sooner in an economic way.
One thing to add to this, and this is long term. I'm not suggesting that this is anything that's going to happen, but it ties all the way back into what Hal said earlier. Don't lose sight of the fact that Florida sits on a carbonate platform, right? So this same material that is being used to build the corals, right? We live on that, right? And so if you have chemical dynamics that are occurring that are essentially leading to the dissolution of that structure, what does that mean over the long term if the ocean continues to decline in pH? What does that actually mean, right? We're talking about the inability to block the sea level inundation, but just as a foundation point, we're living on that base. So what does that mean in the long term? It's an interesting question.
I'd like to thank the Florida Coastal School of Law for offering this program and making it open to the public. It's really wonderful. I've been here several years and glad to be here today. We've talked a lot about various aspects of policy change that should be considered, a lot of that hinges on political will. Do you gentlemen have advice on how we citizens or soon to be members of the bar can further advance political will?
Yes. I'll say one thing and I'll leave it to Joseph, but one thing that was apparent to me, abundantly apparent, when I went to the ocean acidification in Washington was this buy-in of think globally, act locally. That, okay, we can sit back and we can wait for the policymakers, but in reality, that's not going to happen anytime soon. And they saw the actual effects, and in particular, they saw it not only with the oysters, but with the gooey ducks, which is a big part of their economy there in Washington, D.C. And so they decided that we're going to start taking action, and it may be incremental, but their view of the mass, I was really taken back by the conference. Nobody left the conference. The entire day, the room was absolutely packed, and the questions were just amazing. And they were buying into this idea that it's up to us. We have to take this action. And you can do a lot of things locally. I only touched on a few of them. You can do a lot of things locally to at least slow it down. The question is, can we mobilize ourselves to actually take those actions or just talk about it?
Besides it being an election year and asking embarrassing questions if you get to go to a town hall meeting for some of the candidates, it strikes me that, for example, the Navy is already considering what to do about most of its dry docks, for instance, in Newport News and in other bases like San Diego. If you go to the NOAA site, I didn't show it to you, but you can actually see in your community where the sea level is going to be at 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot, 5 foot, 6 foot. And I think to go back to something Hal said to us, is that talking to small groups, talking to people running for office, and explaining to them that, my God, if the Pentagon can understand this, I think Republicans can. Because I think there's a commonality there, and that is we are seeing a, what would we say? We're seeing people pulling at the need for the United States to take action around the world, and partially not making the connection here at home that, well, they wouldn't be asking us to do something if there wasn't a severe drought, if there wasn't a severe flood, or worse yet, our service people can't get to work on certain days because there's flooding in the way of the Newport News naval base. And let's hope that's not a day when we need to have some ships go out for whatever reason. The Coast Guard, I think, more than anybody, took this fairly seriously around 2008. So I think making the connections, and I'll make one last simple connection. When those people strike you who say, oh, climate's always been changing and that sort of thing, it's not humans that are doing it, just tell them isotopes don't lie. The heavy carbon isotopes and the heavy nitrogen isotopes can only come from one source, and that is combustion. And the source of combustion is you and me and everyone driving cars and everyone using electricity. And if they want to argue about this, as I said before, the distraction just takes us away from recognizing that blue carbon is a possible solution, protecting it. Another possible solution is to support your local fishermen, so to speak. So it's, I guess, being willing to embarrass some candidates and take a little heat yourself. But that seems really impotent, doesn't it?
I'll add one thing that I think is interesting. The 2015 study that's in the Journal of Nature and Climate Change that said that Florida was one of 15 states that was in danger. They looked at shellfish industry and they said it's a $6 million industry, and so there are so many interests that are tied to that. So there's an economic component that you can argue, but what's interesting is they didn't even talk about coral reefs. And according to federal studies, the coral reefs are a $300 million industry. Right as we're watching this, you have very respected scientists at the University of Miami saying that they are actually seeing dissolution in winter months in our reef system right now. So there's an economic component to it that I think we need to address as well.
I know you spoke a lot about as far as the ocean and how it affects, but is this something that we're going to see in intercoastals and rivers that ultimately connect to the ocean prior to seeing it in the ocean, as far as the dying off of organisms and things like that? Is it something that we'll see there before we see it in the ocean?
Well, it's happening everywhere. But what I was getting at is where you can take effective action, even if it may be small and incremental, is right near the coastline. And they saw that in Washington. There's been some plans here to reintroduce oysters into the Indian River Lagoon, but it's polluted, right? So we have so much runoff, a lot of non-point source runoff that contributes to lower pH. So you will see it in the river bodies as they make so. I was talking with Dr. White last night about the toxic algae, and he said, yeah, it's really emerging to be a problem right here in the rivers of Jacksonville, right, going to St. John's River. So it's happening around us. And the study I mentioned showed that when they are exposed to low pH environments, they grow faster and their toxins are more potent. So we're seeing that here, right? I think Dr. Quinton is going to give some. All right, so we'll step down.
It's always dangerous to give a professor the last word, but I think I got 5 minutes to do this at any rate. I want to first I want to thank Eric for all that he's done, and he deserves a huge round of applause for. I ended up being sort of a cheerleader and a backup, help, I mean, yeah, and it all sort of works. And also to the Environmental Law Society, you guys have been tremendous today, so thank you for your work. I am going to be very brief. I've taken, gosh knows, pages and pages of notes I could talk about. And I'm sitting here looking at the people who sort of hung in here for the whole time and sort of tied together, because it's interesting. We went from this idea of sea level rise and what's going on with how Wanless this morning almost got depressed with what was going on. One of my colleagues was here and said, the idea that it's inevitable and unstoppable. And then we sort of come around to the problems of acidification and what Eric was talking about. I'm sitting here thinking, we've got Betsy Durling sitting over here with the city of Jacksonville. We've been working on oyster restoration here in Duval County. So people are still working on these kind of things. I was struck by a number of commonalities and threads. In fact, I'm not sure in all the conferences we've had, the summits we've done, we've had any better weaving of all the topics together. This idea of sustainability strategies for the future, we heard an awful lot from Kevin Liskey this morning talking about food security and the climate disruption. I was really struck with Terry Freeman's discussion about agriculture in Duval County and small farms, and then tie it around to Bob Volte's discussion of the agri-hoods, the idea of bringing those things together. So, it was really sort of really cool. We talked about energy security. The high point, sort of the positive part of the day, in my respect, was when George Carvis and Mike Anthel, go Dolphins, were talking about potential for solar. We think about things that might happen in the future and how this works along. Pat, thoroughly enjoyed your talk on Scalia. That was fantastic. Worked out really great. And, you don't hate to see somebody die, but whatever. We're all going to do it, right? That's the one thing we know about. I did make a note at one point that it seems like death, taxes, and sea level rise are some of the things that are inevitable right now. We talked about property security. And again, that idea of the agri-hoods really sort of struck me. T.R. Hainline did a great job of sort of reviewing everything that's been going on with property rights and how things get paid for over the times. And then, when Christine Klein came in and talked about, water and clean energy and needing to gather information, that's what we do. That's attorneys and scientists do a lot of the same kind of things. And I agree with her that we need to do an honest assessment of eco services. We don't do a good job of understanding what things cost. Hans Tanzler brought forth a lot of experience from his background as the Water Management District Director and talking about where we're going with water planning and things like that. Dr. Siry talking about the challenges of this on the national security thing. And you're right. If the military can understand it, maybe the Republicans can. And then Eric talking about ocean acidification. One of the things that does strike me, and several things struck me today, was 80% of our world population live within 60 miles of the coast. And 3/4 of all of our large cities are in coastal areas. And so we've got to deal with this idea of sea level rise and climate change. They are real, they're happening. But they're happening so slow, and change is something that we as humans don't like to acknowledge. It sort of works very slowly. Pogo said it, I think, best, and they used it in the first Earth Day poster. We have seen the enemy, and he is us. So I hope that as we look forward and we see how our political leaders react to the future, that we're going to see successful ways to make water available and energy sustainable, that we're going to find a way to mitigate the impact of climate change and sea level rise. Because if we don't, I'm not sure I've got to worry about the dissolving of Florida, because I'm not sure we'll be here to have Florida dissolve. So thank you very much for coming. Eric, I don't know if you want to say anything, but to me it's been a fantastic day and thoroughly enjoyed it. So give yourselves a hand for being here.